He came back home after years, but everything felt different. An unexpected presence challenged his loneliness, bringing inevitable changes. Between the weight of the past and the promise of the future, he found himself facing a feeling he thought he had lost forever. Destiny had surprising plans. Before listening to this emotional story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories. The creaking of the iron gate echoed throughout the property, announcing Robert Morgan's arrival at the mansion he hadn't seen in almost 2 years. The driver parked the black limousine in front of the imposing marble staircase, and Robert hesitated for a moment before getting out of the vehicle. His eyes, tired and melancholic, scanned the majestic facade of the house that had once been his home, but now seemed more like a mausoleum of painful memories. With a heavy sigh, he finally exited the car, his steps slow and reluctant as he climbed the stairs. The air was impregnated with the perfume of roses that surrounded the property, a scent that would once have filled him with joy, but now only intensified the pain of absence. The main door opened before he could reach the doorknob, revealing Mrs. Martha, the faithful housekeeper who had been taking care of the mansion for decades. Her wrinkled face lit up with a warm smile, but her eyes couldn't hide her concern. "Welcome back, Mr. Robert," she said, her voice soft and comforting. "It's good to have you home again." Robert nodded briefly, unable to return the smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Martha," he replied, his voice hoarse from little use. "I hope everything is in order." The housekeeper hesitated for a moment, her gaze faltering. "Yes, sir, everything is as you left it. Although—" She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "There have been some changes to the staff that you might want to discuss." Robert raised his hand, interrupting her. "Tomorrow, Mrs. Martha. Today I just want to rest." She nodded, understanding. "Of course, sir. Your room is prepared. Would you like dinner served upstairs?" "That won't be necessary," he replied, already heading toward the staircase. "I'm not hungry." As he climbed the steps, Robert felt the weight of years of absence in each step. The walls, once decorated with happy photos and vibrant artwork, now seemed bare and cold. He had ordered everything removed after the departure of Sarah, his wife. Every image, every object that might remind him of her had been carefully packed away, as if by hiding the physical memories, he could somehow appease the pain of loss. Upon reaching the second-floor hallway, Robert stopped abruptly. Something was different. A subtle fragrance, but undeniably present, hung in the air. It wasn't the aroma of roses from the garden, nor the familiar smell of cleaning products that Mrs. Martha had always used. It was something new, fresh, almost spring-like. Intrigued, and slightly irritated by the unauthorized change, he headed to his room. Opening the door, he was greeted by more surprises. The heavy velvet curtains he had installed to block out the sunlight had been replaced with lighter fabrics in soft cream tones. The darkness he had so desired to maintain had been dispelled, and the late afternoon light entered freely through the window, bathing the room in a golden glow. His eyes scanned the environment, noticing every small alteration. The bedsheets were new, the pillows had been changed, and on the bedside table, Robert frowned. A small crystal vase contained a bouquet of wildflowers, their colorful petals contrasting vividly with the sobriety of the room. He approached, the table gently touching the petals with his fingertips. Who would have dared to make such changes? Certainly not Mrs. Martha, who had always respected his wish to keep things unchanged. A movement in the garden caught his attention. Robert approached the window, his eyes narrowing as he observed an unknown figure among the rosebeds. It was a young woman, dressed in simple, practical clothes, her long brown hair tied in a careless braid. She moved gracefully among the flowers, her skilled hands pruning and caring for the plants with a familiarity that surprised him. Suddenly, as if sensing she was being watched, the young woman looked up. Her eyes met Robert's, and for a brief moment time seemed to freeze. She smiled, a genuine and warm smile that lit up her face, and waved timidly. Caught by surprise, Robert retreated from the window, his heart inexplicably beating faster. Who was that woman, and what was she doing in his garden? The roses were Sarah's treasure, personally cared for by her for years. No one but her should touch them. Determined to get answers, Robert hastily left the room, descending the stairs with an energy he hadn't felt in years. He found Mrs. Martha in the kitchen, preparing what appeared to be tea. "Mrs. Martha," he called, his voice firmer than before, "who is that woman in the garden?" The housekeeper turned, surprised by Robert's sudden appearance. "Ah, you've seen her," she said, a slight nervousness in her voice. "That's Emma, sir. She was hired to take care of the garden a few months ago." "Hired?" Robert repeated, incredulous. "By whom? I didn't authorize any hiring." Mrs. Martha placed the kettle on, the stove buying time before answering. "It was a decision by Mr. Richard, your lawyer. He thought it would be better to keep the garden in order, especially the roses. He said Mrs. Sarah wouldn't like to see them neglected." The mention of Sarah's name made Robert recoil, as if he'd been slapped. He leaned against the doorframe, suddenly breathless. Richard had no right, he muttered, more to himself than to Mrs. Martha. The housekeeper approached, her expression full of compassion. "Mr. Robert, I know it's difficult, but Emma has been doing a wonderful job. The garden has never looked so beautiful since, well, you know." Robert closed his eyes, fighting against the wave of emotions that threatened to engulf him. Part of him wanted to scream, to demand that the intruder be immediately removed from his property. But another part, a part that he had been ignoring for a long time, felt a reluctant curiosity about this woman who had dared to disturb his sanctuary of mourning. "Does she live here?" he finally asked, his voice low and controlled. Mrs. Martha nodded. "Yes, sir, in the old housekeeper's room in the back annex. We thought it would be more practical, considering the size of the garden and the amount of work." Robert processed the information in silence. The idea of a stranger living on his property, caring for Sarah's roses, messing with his things, deeply bothered him. But at the same time, he couldn't deny that the garden, from the little he had seen from the window, seemed to be in excellent condition. "Very well," he said at last, his voice laden with resignation. "She can stay for now, but I want to be informed of all her activities, and make it clear that she should not alter anything beyond the garden without my express authorization." Mrs. Martha seemed relieved. "Yes, sir, I'll do that immediately." Robert turned to leave but stopped at the door. Without looking back, he added, "And Mrs. Martha, the curtains in my room. Please change them back to the old ones." "But sir," the housekeeper began hesitantly, "the doctor said that a little sunlight would be good for—" "The curtains, Mrs. Martha," Robert interrupted, his voice leaving no room for arguments. "And remove those flowers from the bedside table." Without waiting for a response, he left the kitchen, his footsteps echoing through the empty corridors of the mansion. He climbed back to his room, closing the door behind him with more force than necessary. Standing in the middle of the room, Robert suddenly felt exhausted. The weight of the years of mourning, the long journey back, and now these unexpected changes in his carefully constructed routine. Everything seemed to conspire to drain his last reserves of energy. He approached the window again, his eyes involuntarily seeking the figure of the young gardener. Emma was still there, now gently watering the rose bushes. There was a serenity in her movements, an almost palpable connection with the plants she tended to. For a brief moment, Robert allowed himself to imagine what it would be like if Sarah could see the garden now. Would she be happy to see her beloved, roses so well cared for, or would she be resentful that someone else had taken over her role? The question remained unanswered, lost in the void that Sarah's absence had left. Robert closed the curtains with an abrupt movement, plunging the room into the darkness that had become his only companion in recent years. As he prepared for sleep, ignoring the food tray that Mrs. Martha had discreetly left outside his door, Robert couldn't help but think about young Emma. Her presence was like a stone thrown into a long, stagnant lake, creating ripples that threatened to disturb the calm surface of his carefully controlled existence. Lying in bed, enveloped by the familiar darkness, Robert wondered if he had made a mistake in returning. The mansion, which he had hoped to find exactly as he left it, an unchanging sanctuary dedicated to Sarah's memory, showed signs of life and change that he wasn't prepared to face. As sleep finally reached him, Robert couldn't imagine how the presence of this strange young woman in his garden was about to shake the foundations of his carefully constructed world, challenging his deepest convictions and perhaps offering an unexpected chance for redemption and a new beginning. The sun had barely risen on the horizon when Robert opened his eyes, awakened by a sound he hadn't heard in years: bird song. For a moment, he lay still, trying to understand why the usual silence of his room had been broken. Then realization struck him like lightning. He was back at the mansion. Sitting up in bed, Robert rubbed his eyes, still heavy with sleep. The curtains he had asked to be changed blocked most of the morning light, but some stubborn rays managed to infiltrate through the cracks, creating dancing patterns on the polished wooden floor. With a resigned sigh, he got up. The clock on the bedside table read 6:30 in the morning. In another time in another life, this would have been the hour when Sarah would wake him with a gentle kiss, eager to begin her morning ritual in the garden. Now the room was empty, except for his memories and regrets. Robert dressed mechanically, opting for a dark grey suit, as if he were preparing for another day at the office and not for an indefinite stay in his own home. Upon leaving the room, he was greeted by the aroma of freshly prepared coffee. Mrs. Martha was already up, maintaining the house routine as she always had. Descending the stairs, Robert hesitated for a moment before heading to the kitchen. Part of him wanted to avoid any interaction, take refuge in his office with a cup of coffee, and immerse himself in the work he had brought with him. But an unusual curiosity impelled him toward the source of that inviting aroma. Upon entering the kitchen, however, it wasn't Mrs. Martha he found. Standing before the stove, stirring something in a pot, was the young woman he had seen in the garden the day before. Emma, he remembered, feeling a mixture of irritation and involuntary fascination. She turned at the sound of his footsteps, and a genuine smile lit up her face. "Good morning, Mr. Morgan," she exclaimed, her voice cheerful and melodious. "I hope you slept well. I'm preparing an oatmeal with apple and cinnamon. Would you like a bowl?" Robert was momentarily speechless, caught off guard by the informality and the unexpected offer. "I prefer just coffee," he finally managed to say, his voice harsher than intended. Emma's smile faltered for an instant, but she recovered quickly. "Of course, no problem. Mrs. Martha mentioned that you like your coffee strong. It's ready. Let me serve you." Before Robert could protest, she was already moving around the kitchen with a familiarity that bothered him. In seconds, a steaming cup of black coffee was placed before him on the kitchen table. "Thank you," he muttered, still uncomfortable with the situation. He took a sip of the coffee, surprised to find it was exactly as he liked it. Emma returned, her attention to the stove, but continued talking over her shoulder. "Mrs. Martha went out to do some shopping at the local market. She asked me to make sure you had a decent breakfast." Robert nodded silently, observing the young woman as she moved around the kitchen. There was a natural grace in her movements, a lightness that contrasted sharply with the somber atmosphere he had grown accustomed to associating with the mansion. "So," he began, trying to maintain a neutral tone, "you're the new gardener." Emma turned, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. "Yes, sir, I've been here for almost 6 months. Your garden is simply wonderful. I've never seen so many varieties of roses in one place." The mention of roses made Robert stiffen. "My wife," he said, his voice low and tense, "dedicated years to that garden." Emma's smile softened, acquiring a touch of understanding and respect. "I know, sir. Mrs. Martha told me about Mrs. Sarah and her love for roses. I've been doing my best to honor her legacy and keep the garden exactly as she left it." Robert felt a pang of emotion he couldn't name. Gratitude, resentment. It was hard to say. "You seem young for an experienced gardener," he observed, trying to change the subject. Emma laughed softly. "I'm 28, Mr. Morgan, and I grew up on a farm. Taking care of plants is in my blood, but I confess I'm still learning every day, especially with the roses. They're fascinating flowers, full of personality." There was something in the way she talked about the flowers, with so much affection and respect, that reminded Robert of Sarah. For a moment, he almost allowed himself to smile, but the pain of the memory brought him back to reality. "Well," he said, rising abruptly. "Thank you for the coffee. I'll be in my office if Mrs. Martha needs me." Emma seemed a little disappointed by his sudden departure, but nodded politely. "Of course, Mr. Morgan. If you need anything, just call." Robert left the kitchen with long strides, feeling strangely agitated. Emma's presence, her joy and vitality, were like an intruder in his carefully constructed world of mourning and isolation. Taking refuge in his office, Robert tried to concentrate on the documents he had brought with him. Financial reports, contracts, spreadsheets, the kind of work that used to absorb him completely. But today his mind insisted on wandering. Through the office window, he had a partial view of the garden. From time to time he caught glimpses of Emma moving between the flower beds, her face serene as she worked. It was disturbing how she seemed perfectly at ease there, as if she had always been part of that scenario. The hours passed, and Robert found himself increasingly distracted. His eyes kept being drawn to the window, to the garden he had avoided looking at for so long. The roses were in full bloom, their vibrant colors contrasting with the lush green of the foliage. It was a sight that simultaneously consoled and tormented him. Around noon, a soft knock on the door yanked him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called, expecting to see Mrs. Martha. To his surprise, it was Emma who entered carrying a tray. "Sorry to bother you, Mr. Morgan," she said, her tone respectful but not subservient. "Mrs. Martha hasn't returned yet, so I took the liberty of preparing a light lunch for you." Before Robert could protest, she was already placing the tray on a side table. The aroma of a homemade soup filled the environment, making his stomach react involuntarily. "It wasn't necessary," he said, but his voice sounded less firm than intended. Emma smiled gently. "I know, but I thought you might be hungry. It's a vegetable soup with a bit of chicken, nothing too heavy." She paused, as if considering her next words. "Mr. Morgan, I hope I'm not being impertinent, but the garden is particularly beautiful today. The red roses near the gazebo are starting to bloom. I thought you might like to know." Robert felt his heart tighten. Those were Sarah's favorite roses, a rare variety she cultivated with special care. "Thank you for the information," he managed to say, his voice hoarse with contained emotion. Emma seemed to sense his discomfort. "Well, I'll leave you in peace now. If you need anything, I'll be in the garden." With one last gentle smile, she withdrew, softly closing the door behind her. Alone again, Robert found himself facing a dilemma. Part of him wanted to ignore the soup, ignore the roses, ignore everything that could disturb the precarious balance he had built for himself. But another part, a part he thought he had buried along with Sarah, felt a painful curiosity. After several minutes of internal debate, he slowly rose from his chair. With hesitant steps, he approached the window overlooking the gazebo. From there he could clearly see the bed of red roses that Emma had mentioned. The sight hit him like a punch to the stomach. The roses were indeed magnificent. Their buds were beginning to open, revealing deep, velvety red petals. They were exactly as Sarah had described them, like drops of passion frozen in time. Without realizing it, Robert found himself pressing his hand against the window glass, as if he could somehow reach those flowers through the glass and time. A solitary tear ran down his face, the first he had allowed himself to shed in months. That moment, observing the garden he had so avoided, Robert felt something move inside him. It wasn't exactly pain nor exactly relief. It was something more complex, a mixture of longing, gratitude, and surprisingly, a hint of hope. With a deep sigh, he moved away from the window and returned to his desk. His eyes fell on the tray Emma had brought. The aroma of the soup still lingered in the air, inviting. After a moment of hesitation, Robert pulled the tray closer. As he savored the first spoonful of the surprisingly tasty soup, he found himself thinking that perhaps, just perhaps, some changes weren't so bad after all. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of work and intermittent reflections. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, Robert found himself again at the window, his eyes involuntarily seeking Emma's figure in the garden. She was there, as expected, gathering her tools and preparing to end the day. There was something in the way she moved, with such care and reverence for the space around her, that touched something deep inside him. That night, as he prepared for sleep, Robert caught himself thinking not just of the past, as was his habit, but also of the present and, surprisingly, the future. The return to the mansion, which he had feared so much, was beginning to reveal itself as something more than just a painful plunge into memories. As sleep enveloped him, an idea began to form in his mind. Maybe tomorrow he could take a walk in the garden, just a quick walk to see up close the work Emma had done. It was a frightening thought, but also strangely comforting. With this uncertain resolution in mind, Robert fell asleep, his sleep more peaceful than it had been in a long time. Outside, under the starry sky, the roses continued to bloom, silent witnesses to a new chapter that was beginning to unfold at the Rose Manor. The dawn brought with it a soft mist that hovered over the garden of Rose Manor, enveloping the flowers in an ethereal embrace. Robert observed from his bedroom window, hands clasped behind his back, body tense with anticipation of the decision he had made the night before. Today, he would go to the garden. He dressed carefully, opting for more casual clothes than his usual suit, a light blue button-down shirt and khaki pants. Looking at himself in the mirror, he noticed how out of place he seemed in his own clothes, as if he were preparing for an expedition to unknown lands, and not for a simple walk in his own yard. He descended the stairs slowly, each step echoing in the quiet of the morning. The house seemed different at this hour, less oppressive, as if it too were awakening from a long sleep. Upon reaching the kitchen, he found Mrs. Martha preparing breakfast. "Good morning, Mr. Robert," she greeted, surprise evident in her voice. It wasn't common to see him so early, much less outside his room or office. "Good morning, Mrs. Martha," he replied, his voice a little hoarse. "I thought I'd have coffee on the terrace today." The housekeeper almost dropped the cup she was holding. "On the terrace? But you haven't—" Of course, I'll prepare everything immediately." Robert nodded, grateful for Mrs. Martha's discretion. He knew that his behavior in recent years had been at the very least erratic, and he appreciated the way she adapted without questioning. Minutes later, he found himself sitting at the terrace table, a steaming cup of coffee in front of him, and a panoramic view of the garden stretching before his eyes. The mist was beginning to dissipate, gradually revealing the vibrant beauty of the flowers. That's when he saw her. Emma emerged from the mist like an apparition, carrying a watering can and humming softly. She hadn't noticed him yet, absorbed in her morning task. Robert watched, fascinated, the way she moved among the plants, touching them gently, as if each one were an old friend. Suddenly she looked in his direction and stopped, surprise etched on her face. For a moment they remained like this, looking at each other across the distance that separated them. Then, slowly, a smile illuminated Emma's face and she waved, a simple gesture but full of warmth. Without thinking, Robert found himself returning the wave. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but for him it seemed a giant leap. "Good morning, Mr. Morgan," Emma called, her voice carrying easily through the fresh morning air. "You chose a great day to enjoy the garden. The wisteria is particularly beautiful today." Robert felt a lump in his throat. The wisteria had been planted by Sarah in the first year of their marriage. "I noticed," he managed to reply, his voice softer than intended. Emma seemed to sense his emotion. With tact, she changed the subject. "If you want to take a walk later, I'd be happy to show you some of the new varieties we've planted recently. Of course, only if you're interested." The offer caught Robert by surprise. Part of him wanted to refuse immediately, to retreat to the safety of his isolation. But another part, a part that had been growing silently since his arrival, yearned to accept. "Perhaps," he finally replied, surprising himself. "I'll see how my schedule looks." Emma's smile widened. "Of course, no pressure. I'll be around if you decide to come." With a final wave, she returned to her work, leaving Robert with his thoughts and the view of the garden that was slowly awakening to life. The following hours passed in a blur of indecision for Robert. He tried to concentrate on work, reviewing contracts and responding to emails, but his eyes kept drifting to the window, to the garden where Emma worked diligently. Around noon, he couldn't take it anymore. With a resigned sigh, he rose from his desk and headed to the back door. His hands trembled slightly as he turned the knob. The first step into the garden was like diving into another world. The scent of flowers immediately enveloped him, bringing with it a flood of memories. For a moment, Robert stood paralyzed, almost suffocated by the intensity of the emotions that assailed him. "Mr. Morgan?" Emma's soft voice brought him back to reality. She was a few meters away, a look of concern on her face. "Are you okay?" Robert took a deep breath, trying to compose himself. "Yes, It's been a long time since I've been out here." Emma nodded understandingly. "I understand. Would you like me to accompany you, or would you prefer to explore alone?" He hesitated. The idea of walking alone through the garden, facing every memory unfiltered, was frightening. But the alternative... "If it's not too much trouble," he heard himself saying, "I would like you to show me the changes you've made." Emma's face lit up. "It would be my pleasure, Mr. Morgan. Where would you like to start?" Robert looked around, his eyes landing on a familiar bed. "The roses," he said softly. "Let's start with Sarah's roses." Emma nodded, understanding the importance of the moment. Gently, she guided Robert down the stone path to the main rose bed. As they approached, the scent intensified, enveloping them in a cloud of sweet and nostalgic fragrance. "These are the Rosa Gallica," Emma explained, her voice full of respect. "I found Mrs. Sarah's notes about them. She called them the ladies of the garden." Robert felt a tightness in his chest. "Yes, she loved the history behind them. She said they were roses that had witnessed centuries of love and loss." Emma smiled softly. She was right. These roses have a fascinating history. Did you know they were cultivated in Josephine Bonaparte's gardens? I imagine how many secrets they've guarded over the years. As they walked through the garden, Emma shared stories and curiosities about each variety of rose, skillfully interweaving botanical information with personal anecdotes. Robert found himself absorbed, not just by the information, but by the evident passion in the young gardener's voice. They arrived at a small circular bed, where deep red roses bloomed exuberantly. Robert stopped abruptly, recognizing them immediately. "The Falstaff," he murmured, extending his hand to gently touch a petal. "Sarah's favorites." Emma remained silent for a moment, respecting the evident emotion of Robert. Then, softly, she said, "They are truly special. They have an incredible aroma, almost like a mixture of ripe fruits and red wine. Mrs. Sarah had impeccable taste." Robert nodded, unable to speak. Memories flooded his mind. Sarah smiling among the roses, her hair shining in the sun, the sound of her laughter echoing through the garden. For a moment, the pain of loss was almost unbearable. But then something unexpected happened. Mingled with the pain, Robert felt a growing warmth in his chest. It was gratitude. Gratitude for these precious moments he had with Sarah. Gratitude for these roses that still bloomed, keeping a part of her alive. "Thank you," he finally said, his voice hoarse with emotion, "for taking such good care of them." Emma smiled gently. "It's an honor, Mr. Morgan. Each rose here tells a story, and I'm grateful to help preserve them." They continued the walk, Robert now more relaxed, occasionally asking questions or sharing a memory. They came to an area he didn't immediately recognize. "This is a more recent addition," Emma explained. "These are climbing roses that I planted along this arch. I thought it would be a beautiful way to frame the view of the lake." Robert looked at the arch covered with white and pink roses, forming a flowery tunnel that led to a stunning view of the small lake on the property. It was beautiful, and surprisingly, it didn't hurt to look at this new addition. On the contrary, there was something comforting about seeing the garden evolve, grow. "It's very beautiful," he admitted. "Sarah would have loved it." Emma smiled, a gleam of satisfaction in her eyes. "I'm glad you approve, Mr. Morgan. I tried to maintain the original spirit of the garden in all the changes I made." As they returned to the house, Robert felt exhausted, but in a way he hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't the heavy fatigue of depression, but an almost satisfying tiredness. "Thank you for the tour, Emma," he said when they reached the back door. "It was enlightening." "The pleasure was mine, Mr. Morgan," she replied with sincerity. "If you want, I can show you more another day. There's much more to see." Robert hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, I would like that." That night, lying in his bed, Robert reflected on the day. The pain of Sarah's loss was still there, a constant presence in his heart. But now, mixed with that pain, there was something more, a spark of life, possibility. He didn't know exactly what the future held, but for the first time in a long time he felt curious to find out. As sleep enveloped him, Robert found himself thinking of the roses, of Sarah and of the young gardener, whose smile seemed so in tune with the beauty of the garden. The perfume of roses floated through the half-open window, lulling him into a peaceful sleep, filled with colorful and fragrant dreams. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a small seed of hope began to sprout. The days that followed Robert's walk through the garden brought a subtle but perceptible change to the atmosphere of Rose Manor. The oppressive silence that once dominated, the corridors began to dissipate, replaced by a more comfortable quietness, occasionally punctuated by the distant sound of footsteps on the garden gravel or the tinkling of gardening tools. Robert, although still reserved, no longer completely isolated himself in his office. His meals, previously taken alone in his room, now happened more frequently on the terrace, his eyes invariably wandering over the garden as he ate. On a particularly sunny morning, about a week after his first foray into the garden, Robert found himself again on the terrace, a cup of coffee in his hands, watching Emma work. She was pruning some rose bushes, her face concentrated on the task, completely oblivious to the attentive gaze of the house's owner. It was at this moment that Mrs. Martha appeared, carrying a tray with breakfast. "You look better, Mr. Robert," she commented softly as she arranged the table. Robert looked away from the garden, surprised by the observation. "How so, Mrs. Martha?" The housekeeper smiled gently. "Well, you've been leaving your room more, you're eating better, and your eyes, they seem less sad, if you'll allow me to say." Robert remained silent for a moment, reflecting on Mrs. Martha's words. It was true that he felt different, although he didn't know exactly how to define this change. "Maybe it's the fresh air," he finally said, his voice low. Mrs. Martha nodded, her gaze turning to the garden, where Emma was now watering some plants. "Or maybe it's the company," she suggested delicately. Before Robert could respond, a cry of surprise from the garden caught the attention of both. Emma had tripped over a garden hose, dropping the watering can and completely soaking her clothes. Without thinking, Robert stood up, ready to go help her. He stopped abruptly as he realized what he was doing, surprised by his own impulse. Mrs. Martha, noticing his hesitation, quickly intervened. "I'll get some towels for Miss Emma," she said, already heading inside the house. "Perhaps you could check if she's all right." Robert hesitated for a moment, then slowly nodded. With cautious steps, he descended the terrace stairs toward the garden, approaching Emma, who was now laughing at her own misfortune. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice carrying a concern that surprised him. Emma looked up, her eyes widening, slightly at seeing Robert so close. "Oh, Mr. Morgan, I'm fine, just a little soaked," she replied, still laughing. "I think the roses decided to give me an extra bath today." Robert felt the corners of his mouth curving involuntarily. It wasn't exactly a smile, but it was the closest he had come to one in a long time. "It seems so," he agreed, extending his hand to help her up. Emma accepted his help, her touch light and warm against Robert's skin. For a brief moment they remained like this, hands joined, gazes meeting. There was something in that instant, a connection that neither had expected. The moment was broken by Mrs. Martha's arrival with the towels. "Here, dear," she said, handing them to Emma. "Why don't you go dry off and change clothes? I'm sure Mr. Robert won't mind if you take a short break." Emma blushed slightly, releasing Robert's hand. "Thank you, Mrs. Martha. And thank you, Mr. Morgan, for the help. I'll get back to work as soon as I change." Robert nodded, suddenly aware that he was still in the garden, closer to the roses than he had been in years. The scent of the flowers enveloped him, bringing with it a wave of memories, some painful, others surprisingly sweet. "There's no rush," he heard himself saying. "The garden, it can wait." Emma smiled, grateful, before retiring to change clothes. Robert remained there, amidst the roses, feeling the sun on his face and the smell of damp earth beneath his feet. It was a strangely comforting sensation. "Do you want to go back to the terrace?" Mrs. Martha asked softly. Robert considered for a moment, then shook his head. "No, I think I'll stay here a while longer. If you don't mind, could you bring my coffee?" The surprise on Mrs. Martha's face was quickly replaced by a warm smile. "Of course, Mr. Robert. I'll be back in a moment." Alone in the garden, Robert allowed himself to really look around for the first time. The roses were magnificent, of course, but there were also other flowers that he didn't immediately recognize. Vibrant colors and diverse forms mixed harmoniously, creating a living picture of natural beauty. His eyes landed on a small wooden bench hidden between two rose bushes. With a start, he recognized it. It was the bench where he and Sarah used to sit on Sunday afternoons, planning the future or simply enjoying each other's company. With hesitant steps, Robert approached the bench. He ran his hand over the wooden surface, feeling the familiar grooves under his fingers. Slowly he sat down, letting the memories envelop him. This was how Emma found him a few minutes later, when she returned to the garden. She stopped a few meters away, unsure whether to approach or give him privacy. Robert, noticing her presence, looked up. Their eyes met, and for a moment neither knew what to say. "This was her favorite place," Robert finally said, his voice soft. "Sarah loved to sit here and watch the bees on the flowers." Emma approached cautiously, as if afraid to disturb the peace of the moment. "It's a beautiful place," she commented. May I sit?" Robert hesitated for a second, then nodded, moving slightly to make room for her on the bench. For a few minutes they sat in silence, observing the garden. The buzzing of bees and the occasional birdsong were the only sounds that broke the quietness. "You know," Emma began hesitantly, "when I started working here, I felt as if the garden was sad. The flowers were there, of course, but something was missing. Life, perhaps." She paused, looking at Robert. "But in the last few days, it's as if something has changed. The colors seem more vibrant, the air lighter." Robert absorbed her words, feeling a complex mixture of emotions. "Maybe the garden was just waiting," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Waiting for what?" Emma asked gently. Robert looked at her, really, looked for the first time since she had arrived at the mansion. He saw not just the young gardener, but a woman with depth, compassion, and an understanding that went beyond her words. "Waiting for someone to see it again," he answered, his voice laden with emotion. "For someone to care." Emma smiled softly, her eyes shining with understanding. "Gardens are like that, Mr. Morgan. They reflect the love and care they receive, and sometimes they have the power to heal those who care for them." In that moment, sitting on the bench that held so many memories, beside a woman who had brought life not only to the garden but to the mansion itself, Robert felt something inside him loosen. It wasn't the end of his pain, nor the forgetting of Sarah. It was perhaps the beginning of something new, an acceptance, an openness to possibilities that he thought were forever out of his reach. "Emma," he said, his voice firmer than it had been in years, "would you tell me more about the changes you made to the garden, I think I'd like to learn." Emma's smile widened, illuminating her entire face. "It would be my pleasure, Mr. Morgan. Where would you like to begin?" And so, on that sunny morning, among roses and memories, Robert took another step toward life. As Emma spoke animatedly about different species of flowers and gardening techniques, He allowed himself, for the first time in a long time, to feel the hope of a new beginning. The garden around them seemed to vibrate with renewed energy, as if silently celebrating this small but significant victory. And somewhere, perhaps not as distant as one might think, the spirit of Sarah smiled, satisfied to see that love, like roses, had the power to bloom even in the most unlikely soils. The weeks that followed brought a gradual but notable transformation to Rose Manor. The silence that once reigned supreme gradually gave way to a gentle symphony of life. The tinkling of gardening tools, Emma's occasional laughter echoing through the garden, and, to everyone's surprise, Robert's voice, increasingly present in everyday conversations. An unexpected routine began to form. Every morning after breakfast, Robert would join Emma in the garden. At first, he merely observed, asking occasional questions about the different species of flowers or cultivation techniques. But gradually, encouraged by Emma's patience and enthusiasm, he began to participate more actively. On a particularly pleasant morning, Robert found himself on his knees beside Emma, his gloved hands sunk into the rich soil of the garden. They were planting a new variety of roses, one that Emma had chosen especially for that section of the garden. "These are called summer memories," Emma explained, gently placing a seedling in the hole that Robert had dug. "They have a wonderful aroma and bloom in a soft pink shade, almost like the sunset." Robert nodded, absorbing the information. His hands moved carefully, covering the roots of the plant with soil. It was a simple gesture, but laden with meaning. He was, literally, planting something new in a garden that for so long had been merely a memorial to the past. "Sarah would have loved these," he commented softly, a melancholic smile playing on his lips. "She always said a garden needs constant renewal to stay alive." Emma looked at him, her eyes full of understanding. "Your wife was a wise woman," she said, "and she was right. A garden, like life, needs changes and new beginnings to fully flourish." Robert paused for a moment, reflecting on Emma's words. "You know," he began, his voice laden with emotion, "for a long time, I thought keeping everything exactly as Sarah had left it was the way to honor her memory. But now I realize that perhaps the true tribute is to continue caring for and making the garden grow." Emma smiled gently, placing a hand on Robert's arm in a gesture of comfort. "I'm sure that's exactly what she would want. Each new flower, each new shrub, is a celebration of the love she had for this place." In that moment, something subtly changed between them. Emma's touch, though innocent, sent a wave of warmth through Robert. Their gazes met, and for an instant time seemed to stop. There was a connection there, a mutual understanding that went beyond words. The moment was broken by the sound of Mrs. Martha calling from the terrace. "Mr. Robert, phone for you. It's Mr. Richard, your lawyer." Robert blinked as if coming out of a trance. "Ah, yes. Thank you, Mrs. Martha. I'm coming." He stood up, cleaning his gloved hands on his pants. "Sorry, Emma. I must take this." Emma nodded, smiling. "Of course, Mr. Morgan, I'll continue with the planting. Perhaps we can finish together. Later?" "I would like that," Robert replied, surprising himself with the sincerity in his own voice. As he walked back to the house, Robert found himself reflecting on the change in his life over the past few weeks. The pain of Sarah's loss was still there, of course. He doubted it would ever completely disappear. But now, mixed with that pain, there was a growing sense of life, of possibility. The conversation with Richard was brief, but significant. The lawyer was calling to inform him about some investments that were doing well, and to ask if Robert would like to consider some new business opportunities. "Actually, Richard," Robert heard himself saying, "I've been thinking about making some changes. Remember that idea Sarah had years ago about turning part of the property into a botanical garden open to the public?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Yes, of course," Richard replied, the surprise evident in his voice. "But I thought you had discarded that idea after." "Well, you know." Robert took a deep breath. "I know, but I think it's time to reconsider. Sarah always wanted to share the beauty of this place with others. Maybe it's time to realize that dream of hers." The conversation continued for a few more minutes, with Richard promising to research the legal and logistical details of the project. When Robert hung up the phone, he felt a mixture of anxiety and excitement that he hadn't experienced in years. Returning to the garden, he found Emma still working on the new rose seedlings. She looked up when he approached, a smile illuminating her face. "Is everything all right, Mr. Morgan?" she asked, noticing something different in his expression. Robert nodded, a small smile forming on his lips. "Yes, it is. Actually, Emma, there's something I'd like to discuss with you. An idea I had, or rather an idea that Sarah had a long time ago, and that I think it's time to realize." As Robert explained the concept of the botanical garden, Emma's eyes widened with excitement. "That's wonderful, Mr. Morgan," she exclaimed. "I can imagine how many people could benefit from the beauty of this place. And what a beautiful tribute to Mrs. Sarah's memory." "I thought you might like the idea," Robert said, feeling increasingly confident in his decision. "Actually, Emma, I was hoping you could help me with this. Your knowledge and passion for this garden would be invaluable to the project." Emma was momentarily speechless, moved by the trust Robert was placing in her. I would be honored." Mr. Morgan, truly honored. In that moment, observing the enthusiasm on Emma's face and feeling his own excitement grow within him, Robert realized he was giving more than just a new purpose to the garden. He was giving a new purpose to himself. The rest of the afternoon was spent in an animated discussion about possibilities for the botanical garden. Ideas flowed freely between Robert and Emma, each feeding the other's enthusiasm. They talked about new species that could be introduced, educational areas for schools, even the possibility of a small cafe overlooking the lake. When the sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of pink and orange, Robert and Emma found themselves again sitting on Sarah's favorite bench, exhausted but exultant. "You know, Mr. Morgan," Emma said softly, looking at the garden bathed in the golden light of the late afternoon, "I think Mrs. Sarah would be very proud of you today." Robert felt a lump in his throat, moved by Emma's words. "Thank you," he managed to say. I hope so." There was a moment of comfortable silence between them, broken only by the song of birds retreating for the night. "Emma," Robert finally said, his voice low but firm, "I want you to know how much I appreciate everything you've done here, not just for the garden, but for me too. You've brought life back to this place in a way I didn't think was possible." Emma looked at him, her eyes shining with emotion. "It's been a pleasure, Mr. Morgan, truly. This garden, this house, there's something special here. I'm just happy to be able to be a part of it." Their gazes met, and once again, that ineffable connection between them was present. It was something new and at the same time familiar, frightening and yet comforting. When they finally stood up to return to the house, something had subtly changed. It wasn't just the garden or the plans for the future. It was something between them, a seed of possibility that had been planted, as promising as the new roses they had cultivated together that morning. As they walked side by side through the garden paths, the perfume of roses hanging in the night air, Robert allowed himself for the first time in a long time to look not only at the past with longing, but to the future with hope. And by his side, Emma smiled, her heart full of a joy she didn't yet dare to name. The garden around them seemed to vibrate with renewed energy, as if it knew it was about to become the setting for a new story. A story of rebirth, of second chances, and perhaps, just perhaps, of a new love blooming among the roses. The months that followed brought a remarkable transformation to Rose Manor. The Botanical Garden project, initially just a nostalgic idea, quickly came to life under the dedicated care of Robert and Emma. The property, once silent and melancholic, now buzzed with the activity of landscape architects, builders, and of course an expanded team of gardeners. Robert, to the surprise of all who knew him, dove headfirst into the project. His mornings, once spent in isolation in his office, were now filled with animated meetings, discussions about garden design, and long walks around the property with Emma, planning every detail of the new venture. On one of these mornings, Robert and Emma were inspecting the progress of the new orchid greenhouse, an addition that promised to be the highlight of the botanical garden. The autumn sun filtered through the newly installed glass, creating a kaleidoscope of light and shadow over the delicate plants. "It's amazing how everything is taking shape so quickly," Emma commented, her face illuminated with enthusiasm. "I can't wait to see all these orchids in full bloom." Robert nodded, a soft smile on his lips. "It's true, sometimes I have to pinch myself to believe all this is really happening." Emma looked at him, a curious expression on her face. "Regrets?" "No," Robert replied quickly, surprising himself with the certainty in his own voice. "Actually, it's exactly the opposite. For the first time in years, I feel like I'm truly living." The look they exchanged in that moment was laden with an emotion that neither was completely ready to name. There was a mutual understanding, a silent recognition of how much they had grown together in recent months. The moment was interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. Richard, Robert's lawyer, entered the greenhouse, a wide smile on his face. "Robert, my friend," he exclaimed, extending his hand for a warm handshake. "The place is looking magnificent. I can hardly believe the transformation." Robert returned the handshake, genuinely happy to see his old friend. "Richard, it's good that you could come. Let me introduce you. This is Emma, our head gardener and the true mind behind all this beauty." Emma blushed slightly at the compliment, extending her hand to Richard. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Richard. Mr. Morgan speaks very highly of you." Richard smiled, looking from Emma to Robert with a knowing expression. "The pleasure is all mine, Emma. And please call me just Richard. Anyone who can bring a smile back to this old grump's face is practically family." Robert cleared his throat, a bit embarrassed. "Well, why don't we take a walk around the property? There's much I want to show you, Richard." As they walked along the winding paths of the garden, Richard couldn't help but notice the changes, not just in the environment, but in Robert himself. His friend, who for so long had seemed a shadow of himself, now walked with a renewed purpose, his eyes shining as he explained each detail of the project. At a moment when Emma moved away to instruct some workers, Richard took the opportunity to speak privately with Robert. "You look well, my friend," he commented, his voice laden with sincerity. "Better than I've seen you in years, actually." Robert nodded, a thoughtful smile on his face. "I feel better, Richard. It's as if I had awakened from a long sleep." Richard cast a significant look in Emma's direction, who was animatedly conversing with the workers a few meters away. "And I imagine your beautiful gardener has something to do with this?" Robert followed Richard's gaze, feeling an unexpected warmth rise up his neck. "Emma has been instrumental in the project. Her knowledge and dedication are incredible." Richard murmured, a gleam of amusement in his eyes. "Knowledge and dedication. Of course. And the fact that she is young, beautiful, and clearly enchanted by you has nothing to do with it, right?" "Richard," Robert exclaimed, surprised by his friend's frankness. "It's nothing like that. Emma is a colleague, a friend, nothing more." Richard raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, but his smile didn't diminish. "If you say so, my friend, I'm just commenting on what I see, and what I see is a man who is finally allowing himself to live again." Before Robert could respond, Emma joined them again. "Is everything all right, gentlemen?" she asked, noticing Robert's disturbed expression. "Perfectly fine," Richard replied cheerfully. "Just reminiscing about old times, isn't that right, Robert?" Robert nodded distractedly, still processing Richard's words. The rest of the tour passed in a blur for him, his mind a confusion of conflicting thoughts and emotions. Later that night, after Richard had departed and the property had quieted down, Robert found himself on the terrace, contemplating the garden bathed in moonlight. His friend's words echoed in his mind, forcing him to confront feelings he had tried to ignore. Could it be possible? After all this time, after all the pain and loss, was his heart really opening to the possibility of a new love? The sound of soft footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. Emma appeared, carrying 2 cups of tea. "I thought you might like a warm drink," she said softly, offering him one of the cups. "The night is a bit chilly." Robert accepted the cup with a grateful smile, his heart involuntarily accelerating with Emma's proximity. "Thank you, Emma, that's very kind of you." They stood side by side, looking at the garden in silence for a few moments. The full moon hung low on the horizon, bathing the flowers in an ethereal silver light. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Emma murmured, her voice almost a whisper. "Sometimes when I see it like this under the moonlight, it almost seems magical." Robert turned to look at her, observing how the moonlight softened her features, highlighting the delicate curve of her neck, the shine in her eyes. "Yes," he replied softly, "it is truly magical." Their gazes met, and for a moment the world seemed to disappear around them. There was a tension in the air, an almost palpable electricity between them. Emma was the first to break the silence, her voice trembling slightly. "Mr. Morgan, Robert, But before she could finish, the shrill sound of the house telephone cut through the night air. Robert blinked, as if coming out of a trance. I should answer that," he said, his voice hoarse. "It might be important." Emma nodded, a flash of disappointment crossing her face. "Of course, I understand. Good night, Mr. Morgan." As Robert hurried inside to answer the phone, he couldn't help but feel that something crucial had been interrupted. Something that, once started, could not be easily ignored or forgotten. The call was from a supplier, a trivial matter that could easily have waited until the next morning. When Robert returned to the terrace, Emma had already retired to her room. Standing alone under the starry sky, Robert allowed himself for the first time to truly consider his feelings for Emma. The admiration for her work, the comfort of her presence, the joy she brought to his life, all of this added up to something he could no longer deny. With a deep sigh, Robert looked at the portrait of Sarah that he still kept in his office. "What would you say, my love?" he murmured to the smiling image of his late wife. "Is it really time to move on?" As the night progressed, Robert remained on the terrace, his heart divided between the past he loved and the future he was beginning to envision. In the garden below, the roses swayed gently in the night breeze, as if nodding in silent encouragement. Rose Manor, once a monument to loss and solitude, now seemed to be on the verge of a new chapter, and Robert, for the first time in years, felt ready to turn the page. The days following Richard's visit were marked by a subtle tension, almost imperceptible to those who didn't know well the dynamics of Rose Manor. Robert, now painfully aware of his growing feelings for Emma, found himself divided between the desire to get closer and the fear of betraying Sarah's memory. Emma, for her part, seemed to sense the change in Robert's behavior. Their interactions, once easy and natural, were now punctuated by uncomfortable silences and averted gazes. The young gardener strived to maintain normalcy, but it was evident that something had changed that night on the terrace. It was on a particularly muggy afternoon that things came to a critical point. Dark clouds accumulated on the horizon, promising an imminent storm. Robert and Emma were in the garden, discussing the final details for the inauguration of the botanical garden, which was scheduled to happen in a few weeks. "I think we should consider a temporary cover for the rare orchids exhibition area," Emma suggested, consulting her notes. "The weather has been quite unpredictable lately." Robert nodded distractedly, his eyes fixed on a distant point. "Yes, of course. Whatever you think is best." Emma frowned, noticing the lack of enthusiasm in his voice. "Mr. Morgan, is everything okay? You seem distant these last few days." The question caught Robert by surprise. He turned to face her, feeling his heart accelerate as he met Emma's concerned gaze. "I am fine," he began, but the words sounded false even to his own ears. A distant thunder echoed, making both look at the rapidly darkening sky. Raindrops began to fall, first sparse, then in a sudden and intense downpour. "Quick!" Emma exclaimed, instinctively taking Robert's hand. "We have to take shelter." They ran through the garden, the rain falling in torrents around them. The path to the main house seemed too long, so Emma guided them to the small gazebo near the lake. Breathless and soaked, they finally reached shelter. Robert suddenly found himself very aware of Emma's proximity, of their still intertwined hands, of how her wet clothes clung to the curves of her body. That was unexpected. Emma laughed nervously, releasing Robert's hand and trying to arrange her wet hair. Robert couldn't look away. There was something wild and beautiful about Emma in that moment. Her cheeks flushed from the effort, her bright eyes, raindrops glistening on her eyelashes. "Emma," he began, his voice hoarse with emotion, "I need to tell you something." She turned to him, her eyes widening at the intensity of his gaze. "What is it, Mr. Morgan?" "Robert," he corrected gently. "Please, call me Robert." Emma nodded, a soft blush coloring her cheeks. "Robert," she repeated, the name sounding like a caress on her lips. The sound of his name in Emma's voice broke the last barriers of Robert's resistance. In an impulsive movement he approached, taking her face between his hands. "I shouldn't feel this," he murmured, his eyes roaming every detail of Emma's face. "After Sarah, I swore that never again." "Robert," Emma whispered, her voice trembling with emotion, "it's okay. You don't need to say anything." But he needed to. The words he had repressed for so long now overflowed, uncontrollable, like the storm around them. "You've brought life back to this place, Emma. Not just to the garden, but to me, and I think I'm falling in love with you." The silence that followed was deafening, punctuated only by the sound of rain beating on the gazebo roof and the occasional rumble of a distant thunder. Emma stared at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Oh, Robert," she finally said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I feel something for you too, something I've never felt before, but—" The but hung between them, heavy and inescapable. "Sarah," Robert completed, closing his eyes for a moment. Emma nodded, gently placing her hand over Robert's, still on her face. Is such an important part of your life. I can't replace her." "I know," Robert answered, opening his eyes to face her again, "and I'm not asking that. Sarah will always be a part of me. But Emma, you made me realize that my heart still has room to love." The words hung between them, laden with promise and possibility. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, they moved closer to each other. Their lips met in a soft kiss, hesitant at first, but quickly deepening with years of repressed emotions. It was Emma who finally pulled away, her eyes shining with a mixture of joy and apprehension. "Robert, it's wonderful and frightening. At the same time, we have to think about this carefully. There's so much at stake." Robert nodded, feeling a mixture of exultation and fear. "You're right, of course. We can't simply let ourselves be carried away by the emotion of the moment." They remained there, in the small gazebo, hands intertwined, as the storm raged around them. It was as if the outside world reflected the turbulence of their emotions, wild, unpredictable, but also incredibly alive. When the rain finally began to diminish, they left their shelter, walking slowly back to the mansion. The air was fresh and clean, laden with the aroma of wet earth and freshly washed flowers. As they reached the front door, Robert turned to Emma. "We need to talk more about this," he said softly. "About us. About the future." Emma nodded, as you may see a small smile playing on her lips. "Yes, we do, but not tonight. I think we both need time to process what happened." Robert agreed, resisting the impulse to pull her in for another kiss. "Good night then, Emma." "Good night, Robert," she replied, his name still sounding new and exciting on her lips. As Emma walked away toward her room in the back of the property, Robert entered the mansion, his heart lighter than it had been in years. He headed to his office, stopping before Sarah's portrait. "My love," he whispered to the smiling image of his late wife, "I hope you can understand. I hope that, wherever you are, you're happy for me." That night, as the storm calmed outside, both Robert and Emma spent hours awake, reliving the moment in the gazebo, dreaming of future possibilities, but also pondering the challenges they would certainly face. The garden, washed by the rain and gleaming under the moon that now peaked between the dispersing clouds, seemed to vibrate with renewed energy. The roses, their buds heavy with raindrops, seemed ready to bloom with even greater beauty the following morning. At Rose Manor, A new love story was beginning to flourish, as delicate and promising as the first shoots of spring. And although the path ahead was uncertain, there was an undeniable sense of hope in the air, the promise of a new beginning, of a love that, like the roses in the garden, had the power to bloom even after the fiercest storms. The days following the kiss in the gazebo were a whirlwind of emotions for Robert and Emma. Both found themselves in a delicate balance between the excitement of their newly discovered feelings and the caution necessary to navigate this new emotional territory. Work on the botanical garden continued, serving as a welcome distraction and at the same time as a constant reminder of what had brought them together. Each rose planted, each path traced, seemed to carry a new meaning, a silent promise of a shared future. It was on a quiet afternoon, about a week after the storm, that Robert finally gathered the courage to have the conversation that both knew was necessary. He found Emma in the nursery, tending to some delicate orchid seedlings. "Emma," he called softly, not wanting to startle her. She turned, a smile illuminating her face upon seeing him. "Hello, Robert. Have you come to see the new orchids?" He smiled back, feeling his heart accelerate as it always did in her presence. "Actually, I came to see you. I thought maybe we could talk." "About us?" Emma's smile faltered for a moment, replaced by a more serious expression. "Of course," she replied, removing her gardening gloves. "Shall we take a walk?" They left the nursery and walked side by side along the winding paths of the garden. The silence between them was laden with expectation and a hint of nervousness. Finally, Robert stopped near a stone bench, inviting Emma to sit with him. Taking a deep breath, he began. "Emma, what happened in the gazebo? It wasn't a moment's impulse for me. My feelings for you have been growing for some time, and that kiss only confirmed what I already suspected. I'm falling in love with you." Emma looked at him, her eyes shining with emotion. "Oh, Robert," she whispered, "I have strong feelings for you too. But it's complicated," Robert completed, a sad smile playing on his lips. Emma nodded. "Exactly. There's so much at stake here. It's not just about the two of us. There's Sarah's memory, the botanical garden, our age difference." Robert took Emma's hands in his touch gentle but firm. "I know. Believe me, I've been thinking about all this constantly. Sarah's memory. She will always be a part of me, Emma. But I'm beginning to understand that loving you doesn't mean betraying what I had with her." Tears formed in Emma's eyes. "I never wanted to take her place, Robert. Never wanted you to feel like you were replacing her." "And you're not," Robert assured, his voice firm. "What I feel for you is different. New. It's like a garden that blooms in a terrain I thought would never give life again. You're not replacing the old flowers, Emma. You're planting new ones." Robert's words touched Emma deeply. She squeezed his hands, a small smile forming on her lips. "You have a way with words, you know, especially when you use gardening metaphors." Both laughed softly, the tension of the moment dissipating a little. "What about the botanical garden?" Emma asked after a moment. "It's your dream, Robert. Our project. And if things don't work out between us, I don't want to risk everything we've built here." Robert nodded, understanding her concerns. "It's a risk, I can't deny. But Emma, look around us," he made a wide gesture, encompassing the garden. "All this was born from our partnership, our friendship. If we could build something so beautiful, working together, imagine what we could do if we gave love a chance." Robert's words hung in the air between them, laden with hope and possibility. Emma closed her eyes for a moment, as if absorbing not just the words, but also the aroma of the flowers around them, the warmth of the sun on her skin, the sensation of Robert's hands in hers. When she opened her eyes again, there was a new determination in her gaze. "You're right," she said softly. "Maybe it's a risk, but it's a risk I'm willing to take if you are." Robert's face lit up with a smile that Emma had never seen before. It was a smile of pure joy, without traces of the melancholy that usually accompanied it. Without a word, he pulled her close, enveloping her in a tight embrace. They remained like this for a long moment, the world around them disappearing. When they finally separated, both had tears in their eyes, but also radiant smiles. "So," Robert said, his voice hoarse with emotion, "what do we do now?" Emma laughed softly. "Well, I think we could start with a proper date. How about dinner? Something outside the mansion, just the two of us." Robert smiled, suddenly feeling nervous like a teenager. "A date? That sounds perfect." They spent the rest of the afternoon planning their first official date, discussing restaurants and activities with the enthusiasm of a new couple. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of pink and orange, Robert and Emma walked back to the mansion, hand in hand. As they reached the front door, Robert turned to Emma. "You know," he said, a mischievous gleam in his eyes, "I think we owe a thank you to that storm." Emma laughed, shaking her head. "Who would have thought that a little rain could change everything?" "Well," Robert replied, pulling her closer, "they say the best flowers emerge after the strongest storms." And with that, he kissed her again, this time without hesitation, without fear. It was a kiss full of promise, of hope, of a future that both could hardly wait to explore together. When they separated, breathless and smiling, Emma whispered, "I think we just planted something really special here, Mr. Morgan." Robert laughed, the sound echoing throughout the property. "No doubt, Miss Emma, and I can't wait to see it bloom." That night, as Rose Manor quieted down, there was a new energy in the air. In the garden, the roses seemed to lean toward each other, as if sharing a secret. The moon, high in the sky, bathed everything in a silver light, transforming the garden into a fairy tale setting. And in their respective rooms, Robert and Emma fell asleep with smiles on their faces, their hearts full of hope and anticipation for what the future held. Love, like the most beautiful flowers, had found a way to sprout even in the most unexpected soil, promising a spring of infinite possibilities. The weeks that followed brought a new dynamic to Rose Manor. The romance between Robert and Emma flourished as beautifully as the flowers they tended together, bringing an atmosphere of renewal and joy that hadn't been felt in that place for a long time. Their first official date was at a small Italian restaurant in the neighboring town. Robert, nervous as a teenager on his first date, surprised Emma with a bouquet of roses cultivated by himself in the mansion's garden. The gesture, so simple and yet so significant, left Emma emotional. During dinner, they conversed for hours, discovering new facets of each other that daily work in the garden hadn't revealed. Robert spoke about his youth, his dreams before meeting Sarah, and how her loss had transformed him. Emma, in turn, shared stories of her childhood on the farm, her love for nature since she was little, and her own dreams and aspirations. As the night progressed, both were surprised by the ease with which they opened up to each other. It was as if, by allowing their feelings to flourish, they had unlocked a new depth in their relationship. Back at the mansion, walking hand in hand through the moonlit garden, Robert suddenly stopped, turning to Emma. "You know," he said, his voice soft in the quiet night, "I haven't felt like this in so long, so alive." Emma smiled, gently squeezing his hand. "I understand. It's as if everything is new again, isn't it? Like seeing the garden for the first time in spring." Robert nodded, pulling her closer. "Exactly. And you, Emma, you are my spring." The kiss that followed was tender and passionate, sealing a silent promise of a shared future. In the days that followed, Robert and Emma found a balance between their blossoming romance and work on the botanical garden. If before they already worked well together, now their synchronicity was almost palpable. They moved through the garden as if dancing, anticipating each other's needs, perfectly complementing each other. The botanical garden project, driven by this new energy, advanced rapidly. The themed areas took shape, each more impressive than the last. The rose garden, in particular, was a spectacle of colors and fragrances, reflecting the love that now filled Rose Manor. One afternoon, while they worked in the new orchid greenhouse, Mrs. Martha observed them from afar, a knowing smile on her wrinkled face. She approached Robert when Emma moved away to fetch some tools. "You look happy, Mr. Robert," she commented, her voice full of maternal affection. Robert smiled, his eyes following Emma. "I am, Mrs. Martha. More than I thought possible again." Nuwam. Old housekeeper nodded wisely. "You know, sometimes life surprises us. When we think a flower has died, we discover it was only dormant, waiting for the right season to bloom again." Mrs. Martha's words touched Robert deeply. He turned to her, his eyes shining with contained emotion. Do you think Sarah would approve, that she would understand?" Mrs. Martha placed a gentle hand on Robert's arm. "Oh, my dear, I'm sure she would. Mrs. Sarah always wanted your happiness above all. And look at this garden. It has never been so alive, so full of love. This is a testimony to what you two have built together, honoring her memory." Robert felt a lump in his throat, moved by the housekeeper's words. He hugged her briefly, grateful for her wisdom and support. When Emma returned, she found Robert with a renewed gleam in his eyes. She looked at him questioningly, but he merely smiled, pulling retry Claude. Hit the max length for a message, and has paused its response. You can write continue to keep the chat going. Continue edit. Here's the continued translation. When Emma returned, she found Robert with a renewed gleam in his eyes. She looked at him questioningly, but he merely smiled, pulling her into a spontaneous embrace. "What was that for?" she asked, laughing softly. "Just gratitude," he replied, kissing her gently. "For you, for us, for all of this." As days turned into weeks, Robert and Emma's relationship deepened. Like the roots of the plants they tended together, they learned to navigate the challenges that arose, whether related to the garden or to their own hearts. There were difficult moments, of course. Occasionally, Robert would find himself struggling with guilt, fearing he was betraying Sarah's memory. In these moments, Emma was there, patient and understanding, gently reminding him that love is not a finite quantity, that having room in his heart for her did not diminish what he had felt, and still felt, for Sarah. In turn, Emma sometimes felt insecure, worried about always being in the shadow of a woman she couldn't know. But Robert, with his gentleness and devotion, repeatedly showed her that what they had was unique and special in its own right. One night, about 2 months after their first date, Robert surprised Emma with a special dinner in the garden gazebo. He had decorated the place with fairy lights and candles, creating a magical atmosphere. As they savored dessert, a delicious tiramisu prepared by Mrs. Martha, Robert took Emma's hands in his gaze intense and full of emotion. "Emma," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "These last few months have been extraordinary. You've brought light back into my life in a way I never thought possible again." Emma smiled, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Oh, Robert, you've done the same for me. I never imagined I would find a love like this." Robert took a deep breath, gathering courage for what would come next. "Emma, I know it may seem rushed, but life has taught me that when we find something precious, we should grasp it with both hands." He paused, reaching for something in his pocket. "I want to build a life with you. Here, in this garden we've cultivated together, in this house you've helped fill with life again." With that, he opened a small velvet box, revealing a delicate ring with a stone that resembled the soft pink of the first flowers of spring. "Emma Sanders, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Emma was speechless for a moment, her eyes alternating between Robert's anxious face and the ring in his hands. When she finally found her voice, it was choked with emotion. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Robert, 1,000 times yes." Robert slid the ring onto her finger, his hands trembling slightly. When he stood to kiss her, both had tears in their eyes, tears of joy, of hope, of a love that had blossomed against all odds. The kiss was interrupted by the sound of applause. Turning, surprised, they saw Mrs. Martha and some of the mansion's staff observing the scene from afar, all with radiant smiles on their faces. Laughing and crying at the same time, Robert and Emma waved to the small group, their hearts overflowing with happiness. That night, Rose Manor seemed to vibrate with a special energy, as if the very walls and the garden around celebrated the love that had been reborn within its bounds. Later, walking hand in hand through the garden under the starry sky, Robert and Emma made plans for the future, not just for the botanical garden which was about to be inaugurated, but for their life together. "You know," Emma said softly, looking at her engagement ring, "when I first came to work here, I never imagined I would find not just a home, but the love of my life." Robert smiled, pulling her close. "And I never imagined I would find a reason to live again, much less to love. You are my miracle, Emma." As they kissed under the moonlight, surrounded by the roses they had tended together, both felt a deep sense of gratitude and hope. The future opened before them, full of promises, like a garden ready to bloom in spring. Rose Manor, once a symbol of loss and solitude, now pulsed with new life and love. And at the center of it all, like the most beautiful roses in the garden, were Robert and Emma, two hearts that had found in each other not just love, but a new beginning. The news of Robert and Emma's engagement spread quickly, not just through Rose Manor, but throughout the neighboring town. The story of the reclusive widower who found love again with the young gardener captured everyone's imagination, becoming almost a local legend. The preparations for the wedding coincided with the final details for the grand opening of the botanical garden. It was as if Rose Manor was preparing for two major events that symbolized rebirth and new beginnings. One morning, about a month before the scheduled date for the opening and 2 months before the wedding, Robert found Emma in the rose garden, apparently lost in thought as she pruned some roses. "A penny for your thoughts," he said softly, approaching from behind and enveloping her in an embrace. Emma smiled, leaning back against him. "I was just thinking about how everything has changed so quickly. Sometimes it feels like a dream." Robert kissed her temple affectionately. "If it's a dream, I hope I never wake up." Turning in his arms, Emma faced him, her face suddenly serious. "Robert, there's something we need to discuss, something important." Robert's heart accelerated, a pang of concern crossing his face. "What is it, my love?" Emma took a deep breath, gathering courage. "It's about the future, our future. Robert, I want to have children, start a family with you. But I know you already had a family before with Sarah, and I don't know if—" Robert silenced her with a soft kiss. When he pulled away, his eyes shone with unshed tears. "Oh, Emma," he whispered, "nothing would make me happier than having a family with you." Emma's face lit up with a radiant smile. "Really? You really want this?" Robert nodded, gently caressing her face. "More than anything. You know, for a long time after losing Sarah, I thought my chance to be a father again had passed. But you, my love, you made me believe in second chances, in new beginnings." Emma hugged him tightly, tears of joy streaming down her face. "Oh, Robert, I can't wait for us to start this new adventure together." In that moment, as if the universe wanted to confirm the beauty of that instant, a blue butterfly landed on a nearby rose, its wings shimmering in the sun. Robert and Emma watched, amazed, seeing in that small creature a symbol of transformation and hope. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activities. The date of the Botanical Gardens inauguration was rapidly approaching, and there were 1,000 details to be finalized. Robert and Emma worked tirelessly, but always found moments to be together, to dream of their future. One afternoon, while supervising the installation of a new fountain in the center of the garden, Richard appeared unexpectedly. The lawyer smiled upon seeing the couple working in perfect harmony. "Well, well," he said, approaching, "it seems that love really does work miracles." Robert smiled, extending his hand to his old friend. "Richard, what a surprise. We weren't expecting you until next week." Richard shook Robert's hand warmly, then turned to Emma. "I couldn't wait to see the progress, and I must say, the place looks incredible. You two have created something truly special here." Emma blushed slightly at the compliment. "Thank you, Richard. It's been a labor of love, truly." "Speaking of love," Richard said, his eyes falling on the engagement ring on Emma's finger, "I hear congratulations are in order. When's the big day?" 2 months from now," Robert replied, putting his arm around Emma's waist. "A small ceremony here in the garden. with just close friends and family. We'd be honored if you would be my best man, Richard." Richard's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "It would be my honor, old friend. Truly." They spent the rest of the afternoon showing Richard around the property, highlighting the changes and additions that had been made for the botanical garden. The lawyer couldn't help but notice the transformation, not just in the garden, but in Robert himself. The man who for years had been a shell of his former self now radiated life and joy. As the day came to an end and they said goodbye to Richard, promising to keep him updated on both the garden and the wedding plans, Robert found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this moment. Standing on the terrace, with Emma by his side and the garden stretching out before them, bathed in the golden light of sunset, he felt a sense of completion that he had thought would never be his again after Sarah's death. "A penny for your thoughts now," Emma said softly, leaning her head against his shoulder. Robert smiled, pulling her closer. "I was just thinking about how life takes unexpected turns. A year ago, I was lost in grief, convinced that my capacity for happiness had died with Sarah. And now, Emma prompted gently. "Now I have you, a new life, a future I'm actually looking forward to." He turned to face her, taking her hands in his. "I don't know what I did to deserve this second chance, Emma, but I promise you, I'm going to treasure every moment of it." Emma's eyes filled with tears of joy. "Oh, Robert, that's all I want. Just to build a life with you, filled with love and joy and roses." They both laughed at that, the sound mingling with the evening breeze that carried the scent of the garden. As they stood there embracing, the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. In that moment, Robert felt a peace he hadn't known in years. The pain of losing Sarah would always be a part of him, but now it coexisted with the joy of finding Emma, of building something new and beautiful with her. The garden that had once been a sanctuary of grief had transformed into a place of new beginnings, of hope, of life. And as Robert held Emma in his arms, watching the stars emerge one by one, he felt grateful for the journey that had brought him to this place, to this woman, to this second chance at love. The weeks leading up to the botanical garden's grand opening were a blur of activity. Final touches were applied to the various themed gardens, signs were installed, and a small cafe near the lake was completed. Robert and Emma worked side by side, their excitement growing as their vision took shape. The day before the opening, they took a final walk through the gardens, checking that everything was perfect. The roses were in full bloom, the orchid greenhouse was a riot of color and fragrance, and the winding paths invited exploration and discovery. "It's even more beautiful than I imagined," Emma said, her voice filled with wonder as they stood on a small hill overlooking the entire property. Robert squeezed her hand, his heart full. "It's because of you, you know. Your vision, your passion. You brought this garden back to life." Emma smiled up at him, her eyes shining. "We did it together, Robert. That's what makes it so special." As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the gardens, they made their way back to the house. Tomorrow would be a day of celebration, of sharing with the world the beauty they had created together. The grand opening of the Rose Manor Botanical Gardens was a resounding success. Hundreds of visitors from the surrounding towns came to explore the gardens, marvel at the rare plants, and enjoy the peaceful atmosphere. Robert and Emma, standing at the entrance to welcome the guests, couldn't help but feel a surge of pride as they watched people's faces light up with delight. "Look at them," Emma whispered to Robert, nodding toward a group of children running excitedly along a path. "This is exactly what we wanted, to share the beauty and joy of this place with others." Robert nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Sarah would have loved this," he said softly. "She always believed gardens were meant to be shared." Emma squeezed his hand in understanding. There was no jealousy in her heart when Robert spoke of Sarah now, only a deep respect for the woman who had been such an important part of his life. As the day progressed, they mingled with the visitors, answering questions about the plants, sharing stories about the garden's history, and accepting countless congratulations on their engagement. By the time the last visitor had left and the gates were closed, both Robert and Emma were exhausted, but exhilarated. "We did it," Robert said, pulling Emma into his arms as they stood once more on the terrace, looking out over their creation. "Yes, we did," she replied, her voice soft with contentment. "And in 2 months we'll celebrate again, our wedding day." Robert kissed her then under the stars, surrounded by the roses that had brought them together. It was a perfect ending to a perfect day, and a promise of the many perfect days to come. The weeks leading up to their wedding passed in a flurry of preparations. The botanical gardens continued to attract visitors daily, but Robert and Emma still found time to plan their special day. They had decided on a simple ceremony in the rose garden, with only their closest friends and family in attendance. Mrs. Martha had taken charge of the reception preparations, determined that everything would be perfect for the couple who had brought such happiness back to Rose Manor. The night before the wedding, Robert found Emma in the garden, sitting on Sarah's old bench, looking thoughtful. "Nervous?" he asked, sitting beside her. She smiled, leaning against his shoulder. "Not about marrying you, never that. I was just thinking about how much has changed in a year, how much we've both changed." Robert nodded, understanding completely. "For the better, I hope." "Definitely for the better," Emma replied, turning to face him. "Robert, I want you to know that I understand Sarah will always be a part of your heart. I'm not trying to replace her or erase her memory. I just want to add to your life, to create new memories alongside the cherished ones you already have." Robert felt his heart swell with love for this remarkable woman. "Emma Sanders," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you are the most generous, understanding soul I have ever known. And tomorrow I will be the proudest man alive, when I can finally call you my wife." The wedding day dawned clear and perfect, as if nature itself was celebrating with them. The garden was at its most beautiful, roses blooming in profusion, their scent filling the air. Emma, dressed in a simple but elegant white gown, walked down a path strewn with rose petals to where Robert waited beneath an arch covered in climbing roses. Their eyes met, and in that moment, all the doubt, all the pain of the past, all the long, lonely years melted away. The ceremony was brief, but heartfelt. They exchanged vows they had written themselves, promises to cherish and support each other, to nurture their love as carefully as they nurtured their garden. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Robert leaned in to kiss his bride, a cheer went up from the small gathering of guests. It was a moment of pure joy, of triumph over grief, of life asserting itself in all its beauty. The reception was held on the terrace and lawn of Rose Manor, tables decorated with fresh flowers from the garden, delicious food prepared under Mrs. Martha's watchful eye, and music that floated on the evening air created an atmosphere of warmth and celebration. As the night drew on, Robert took Emma's hand and led her to a quiet corner of the garden, away from the festivities. "I have something for you," he said, pulling a small box from his pocket. Emma opened it to find a delicate gold locket. Inside was a tiny portrait of the two of them, taken at the garden's opening. "It's beautiful," she whispered, as Robert fastened it around her neck. "There's something else," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "I want to show you something." He led her along a path she hadn't taken before, to a part of the garden that had been cordoned off for the past few weeks. As they rounded a bend, Emma gasped. Before them was a new garden, one she hadn't seen before. In the center stood a small fountain, and around it beds of roses, but not just any roses. These were new varieties, ones she had never seen before. "What is this?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder. "This," Robert said, his arm around her waist, "is the Sanders garden. I've been working on it in secret, with help from some specialist growers. These roses are a new hybrid, developed especially for you." He pointed to a particularly beautiful bloom, its petals a soft pink with edges of deep crimson. "This one is called Emma's Joy. It's a symbol of our new beginning, our life together." Emma turned to him, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, Robert, this is the most beautiful gift anyone has ever given me." Their kiss, There in the garden that bore her name, surrounded by roses created in her honor, was a seal on their love story. A story of grief transformed to joy, of solitude giving way to companionship, of a garden and two hearts brought back to life through love and care. As they walked back to the reception hand in hand, the stars shone above Rose Manor. The house, once silent and shrouded in sorrow, now rang with laughter and music. The Chio garden, once neglected, now bloomed in splendor, and Robert and Emma Morgan, once lost in their separate lives, now moved forward together into a future as bright and promising as the roses they tenderly cultivated.